Hey everyone, it's Lisa with Are You My Cousin? It's Thursday afternoon, so it's time for another genealogy chat. So I want to welcome you all for joining me today. If this is our first time meeting, I am Lisa Listen. I am the owner and creator of the website Are You My Cousin? Where I really strive to take the overwhelm out of your genealogy research. You'll find lots of blog posts and tutorials over on the website for you to just kind of peruse and see what you can find to help you out with various parts of your genealogy research. So welcome today. If you are joining me again, if you're one of my regulars who joins me each Thursday afternoon, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you guys showing up each week, and I do. Your support is really valuable to me. So thank you for that. Hey, Deb, it's good to see you. Glad that you could join us again today. Hey, Lydia from Michigan. Wonderful. If for those of you who haven't met me before, I am in North Carolina, and it's a beautiful warm day here, kind of crazy warm actually, and we're going to get nice and cold later on this week. So I'm ready for it, quite frankly. Hey, Kelly from Pennsylvania. Yay. Wonderful. So glad you guys are here. This is really some of my favorite time of the year. And not just because it's a beautiful time with the leaves have been changing and just it's a beautiful time of year to get outside, but there's a genealogy relevance to why this is part of my favorite time of the year as well, which I'll share in just a minute. Hey, Diane, good to see you from South Carolina. So yes, as you're coming in, feel free. You're welcome to let us know where you're watching from. I just think it's kind of fun to see where we're all from. Hey, Rosemary from Tampa. Yay. Hey, Katie from Oregon. Nice to see you again. I'm glad you could join us again. And so one of the reasons that I love this time of year when it comes to genealogy research is because it's cooler, obviously. And this is one of the perfect seasons for doing cemetery research. And for those of you who have done this as a genealogist, it's really wonderful. And obviously it varies with where you live in the US, or perhaps you're watching from Canada as Barbie is. Or from somewhere else. But this is a really good time of year, particularly here in the southeast of the US, to do cemetery research. And actually winter's very good down here as well. Maybe not so much in areas where you get such a snowy climate. But the reason is when the leaves are off the tree, number one, it's easier to find some of those cemeteries out in the woods, family cemeteries, if you're looking for those. But also, there are not as many bugs. I don't like bugs. And so it's easier, there are not as many snakes. So depending on where you're going, I like to wait till it's cold, and then I don't have to worry about the bugs and snakes as much. Don't have to worry about as much about poison ivy, unless you're super sensitive to it. And of course, the vines are still there, but the leaves are not. So, there are just some advantages to doing it this time of year. Plus, it's just gorgeous. It's not so hot. So this is my time of year to be doing cemetery research, which is one of the reasons we're talking about finding where your ancestors are buried, because this is tough. We can sometimes find out when they died by using the records. We can find dates, or we can find approximate years, those types of things. But that doesn't mean we know where they were buried. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that here in just a minute. And I'm going to be sharing with you I wanted to talk you through specifically through 3 different types of places to find where your ancestor was buried, and to give you some tips and clues there. And of course, if you have things you want to add, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I will make sure I see those as well. So let me just peek at those real quick before we start talking. Hey, Martha. Oh, so glad you were able to have your day off to join us again today. Stephanie, yay, from New York. Oh, Barbie set up in Canada. They've just had their big first snowfall, which is late, which is kind of funny. Down here, we're lucky to get anything. But I do like snow. I do like winter, but that's because it's winter in the southern US, which is a totally different thing. So yes, we are here today to talk about cemetery research, or we're not so much cemetery research, but how to find out where your ancestor was buried, because there is a lot of valuable information in doing that. Why do we want to know that? Even if we're just finding it's one thing to know your ancestor's date of death, and we certainly want to do that. And those cemeteries, we can oftentimes get that from the tombstone, but we also, there's value in finding where they were buried, because as we know, and you'll see this over on the website a lot, I talk about when you find where that ancestor is buried, there is likely more information in that cemetery or than just your ancestor. So, there's a lot of questions to ask yourself about why are they buried here and who else is here and what are the relationship to these people. So there's a lot of other additional information to get beyond just this is the location of where your ancestor is buried. So, but first we got to find out where he was, right? So one of the first places to look, if you are working in a time period when there were death certificates, is that death certificate, because they do put the place of death on that, or place of burial on the death certificate in most places. So I'm going to actually share my screen with you. Just one second. Here we go. There we go. So you should be able to see that now. Actually, let's see if I can make it a little bit bigger so you guys can see a little bit better. So if you can see down here, I put a little box here, and this is the death certificate. Is a North Carolina death certificate from 1913. This is one of the very early ones. I'm sorry, I think it's Virginia, actually. And it is for one of my greats. I've lost count at the top at the moment. And he died of old age. So he was buried, though. I learned a lot about information about him. As we all know, the very important stuff about who his parents were. But I'm learning for today's talk, we're talking about where he was buried. And this tells me, so on the Virginia certificates, I know on the North Carolina certificates, it's typically in the bottom right-hand corner, could be somewhere else, depending on where you're researching. And this tells me he was buried in Omega, Virginia. Okay, well, that doesn't give me quite as much as I would like to have, just because that's basically a town, but it is a very small town. So what I would do with this particular information is it also gives me who the undertaker was. And I would probably, and it tells me the undertaker was out of South Boston. So this is, actually a little bit close over. It's like one county over. I would probably see what I could find out if there were records out of South Boston for that. But Omega is actually really small. And this is the Bowen family. So I would just start with a search of little churches there. I would start searching for family cemeteries in that area. I would ask people on the ground for that, if I could find them. I would look to see if I would probably go to like a Find a Grave or some of the others to find other Bowen family members to see who else could be buried, perhaps in that Omega area, that might name a particular cemetery there. So the interesting thing here is when you have this, you might get a little town, but you might also, I have seen this where usually they will give the actual name of a cemetery. Sometimes they would say, for instance, instead of saying the location as far as the name, they might say, Bowen Family Cemetery or something like that. Because this is a very small area, this is a very small community, it's rural, there's a part of me that wants to say this is probably going to be, he's probably in a small family cemetery somewhere that doesn't have a formal name. Now, I don't know that for sure, but it would definitely be a clue to me and one that I would follow up on as well. So just thought I'd let you guys know that. Obviously, we have an informant here with the same last name. That is one of his sons. And so I would research and find out where he was buried to see if eventually he ended up in the same place. So make sure as you're reading this, your death certificates for your ancestors, and you are finding these types of documents, don't just stop at the top. Don't just stop at date of death and birth. Don't just stop at parents. Guys, as I always say, read every single box, every single line, and document the information that's there. All right, let me come back to you guys here. Hang on one second. I can get it back over here. There we go. There we go. Hey, let me check the comments. I saw some things flipping in there. Hey, Faye from Florida. CC, hey, good to see you from Ohio. Peggy's from Alaska, and it's -10 there. Oh, my gracious. Okay, so this time of year is probably not the time to go cemetery researching in Alaska. Just thinking. because it's a little bit chilly, obviously. So yes, so I like to, if you're using that time period where you have that particular, if you have the time period where you do have a death certificate, is looking at that would be very helpful. Now, I want to talk a little bit about funeral home records because I know that that is something. Cece said burial place of informant. You hadn't thought of that. Yeah, because the informant person is likely should be somebody who actually knew the deceased. Okay, and likely it's going to be probably an adult child. It could be a brother. It could be, but it's probably a family member. And so I always want to know who the informant is. So that's one of the things when I'm assessing any kind of death information is who is that informant? Who is providing that information? Why are they providing that information in this case for the death certificate? And how accurate do I think it would be? In this case, because it's a son, I would actually think they have that's pretty solid information because they would know where the person was buried. And so if I'm looking at, I'm still going to look in that area. It's not a given, obviously, but it may give me some clues as to some of the cemeteries that would be potentially burial places for that ancestor. So yes, definitely. Glad you found that helpful with that. So let's shift a little bit and talk about funeral home records. Now, these are not always the easiest to find, but I want to make sure you remember to check genealogy databases for this. Ancestry.com has some funeral home records there. So absolutely you want to check all your genealogy databases. There's not a ton of them, but if it's the one that you need, you're golden, right? So be sure, don't assume that the larger genealogy databases are not going to have what you need because they very well may have some, because they do have some of the cemetery records. That's the best case scenario, quite frankly, is if you can find them online. I have also found them talking with at the local level, at like the local archive type levels. So because I do research in Surrey County, North Carolina, I happened to stumble upon, I was a fairly new researcher, but I happened to stumble upon a transcription of funeral home records for a particular funeral home out of Mount Airy. It's I think the Moody Funeral Home. And there was my great-great-grandmother's information listed there. So that was important, obviously, information for me. I was able to find that funeral home record there, and then have since, as I've built out the family line, been able to find more and more helpful information there. So some of these things are it appears random to us, quite frankly, but they can be digitized at that local level. It could be in the digital archives for the library. It could be if the county has a museum. It could be one of those types of places where you'll find them digitized, if you're lucky enough to find them digitized. So that's again, so if they're not on Ancestry, but if you can find them at that local level digitized, again, that's very helpful information for you. Now, those are a little random, but they do work. The other thing you can do is talk to the funeral home community there in the area where your ancestors lived. Okay, so if you know the funeral home, if you do not have a death certificate, you know about the time period an ancestor died, pretty sure you know the location. You can actually use census records and city directories to determine what funeral homes were in business during that time period and see if any of them are still in business today. Then, if they are, reach out to them. If they're not, what I would recommend is, again, talk to the funeral home community. Or if you're looking for, say, a specific family cemetery and you're not really sure where it could be, talk to the people there who are in the business, because they likely know some of the history when it comes to cemeteries in the area. They may know if a particular funeral home was sold and renamed and that the records still exist. They may know where some of those smaller family cemeteries are, or more importantly, who to ask where those cemeteries are. So definitely want to reach out to some of those folks. Let them know what you are researching, why you're researching it, so they don't, it's not like a cold call. It's helpful if you can tell them what you're looking for. I had a wonderful follower share with me a wonderful story one time where she said she was researching and she stumbled across the descendant of someone who owned a funeral home, and the old funeral home records were in their basement, and she actually was able to find what she needed. So there are all kinds of kind of crazy serendipitous stories out there that I never want to overlook looking for funeral home records. I will tell you, you have to be really tenacious. It's not easy. It's not fast by any stretch of the imagination. And I would say most of the time, you're going to need to be offline for these records. So it's going to require phone calling. It's going to require perhaps a trip, just depending on if you're able to do that or not, but check for things like the death certificate first, if you're in that time period that they would have been utilized. Check for the genealogy databases, check Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, Family Search, all of those to see if they might be there. Check state archives, state libraries to see if anything has been abstracted and digitized, or maybe it's just abstracted in a book. That would be helpful as well. So you have a few options to look at. And again, always reach out to that genealogy society in the county where your ancestors lived. They tend to know these things. So for instance, one of the sites that I use quite frequently is called cemeterycensus.com. And I use that to see where an ancestor was buried. So it's a much smaller version of something like a Find a Grave, but it tends to be fairly local. People would go in, they would go out, they would document a cemetery, and so then they would list all of them. The webmasters would take the document, the pictures and the information, and put it out there and upload it to their site. Well, there was one in particular in Surrey County, I believe, as well, and I had been up there speaking, and I talked to the Genealogy Society guys there. I actually talked to the people who owned the site or who had surveyed the cemeteries in that particular county for the site. And I said, I'm really looking for this particular cemetery and I want to go. Can you? And he said, yes. He said, the directions on the site are good. And I said, I was by myself. I said, is it safe for me to go? That's another thing, as a single woman out there, I didn't want to be just driving through the mountains and stuff. He said, absolutely. It's in an area you should feel very comfortable going. He said, but I will tell you, he said, the age of the stone that you're looking for, you will probably not find it because of just damage, wind, and weather damage, he said. But we were able to corroborate by using the church records. So it wasn't a funeral home record, but by talking, I was seeking out information from the local Genealogy Society guys, and they were able to get me what I needed and help me find what I needed. So that was really a cool thing to do. So you have to be just dogged in your search for these. Let's see. Danny said, hey, you're from Ohio as well. You found your great-great-grandmother's grave where you were looking for her daughter's grave. Yes, great-grandfather's sister. They're buried about 50 miles from your home. Isn't that always interesting when you can find them that close to where your home is? I have stumbled across that as well. And I just thought that was really cool to be able to do. But again, looking at somebody else's grave, you can find those others. Now, when you discover where your ancestor is, so if they are buried in a cemetery that has an actual office, get them on the phone. Particularly if you are researching from a distance. So maybe you've identified the cemetery where your ancestor is buried. And it could be a large one, it could be a small one, but maybe it's a town cemetery. And one of the things would be get them on the cemetery office on the phone. One, you can confirm that your ancestor would be buried there. And then the other thing that you can do would be talk to them about who else might be in that particular family plot. Is that individual buried in a family plot, and who else is there? Alternately, if you know other family members are buried there, and you suspect your guy could be there, talk to them and ask them and say you're interested in, you're researching this particular ancestor. You know that a large number of the Bowens are buried in this particular cemetery. you know, would they be able to check their records? Could they help you determine if there were others that are not listed on the website or that are buried that you're specifically looking for there? I have had actually really good luck when I have called cemetery offices before. They have those guys have been incredibly helpful to me and really solved some put some pieces of the puzzle together. So I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to the cemetery offices as well. So definitely you want to do that. Lastly, if you're trying to find where your ancestor was buried and you sort of suspect there might have been a family cemetery, but you're not really sure, or maybe they're buried in a cemetery that doesn't have an office. It seems to be where all our ancestors are buried, right? They're buried somewhere out and what's today a field, but it wasn't at the time, but today is a field. And you're trying to kind of figure out some information about that to see, is your ancestor there? Or maybe you find some of that family is buried in a particular cemetery and you notice that there are some markers that are field stones or that don't have names on them. So that's problematic for us as researchers because we know there's a grave there, but we don't know who it is, right? I would encourage you to reach out to the county office, whatever governmental office at the local level is in charge of cemeteries. They typically are aware of these family cemeteries, particularly if there's been construction kind of going on as towns grow, and ask them what records they have and if they have further information on that. They may have surveys that were done years and decades ago. They could have surveys in their records of different small cemeteries that are around that are no longer active cemeteries. So those are the types of records you can get. Sometimes it's hard to find the right person at the right office to talk to. Actually, what I have done in the past is I have just called the town office and said, this is what I am looking for. Who's the next office I need to talk to? And so was able to make rate and find out who was in charge and who I needed to talk to. One day, I actually had one case where I was looking on it and I was like, I know, I have all the information. I actually know where it is. I discovered the family cemetery was mentioned in an old deed. I knew it was there and I knew this guy was there, but I couldn't get the rest of the information that I needed. And so I wasn't getting a great response from the county courthouse. We were just missing each other, the person that I needed to talk to. And so I think it was in the land use department for that particular county or town. And so it was a short drive from home. It was about 45 minutes away. So I just went down there. Turned out the receptionist this was a city office, a town office, was the town historian. And I talked with her. And boy, we got that problem settled right quick. We found exactly what we needed to know. And so that was a really good way to go about doing things. Sometimes you just need to get to the right person. Why do I tell you that? One, you just have to keep going and pushing and pushing. The other thing is that she turned out to be the town historian. She didn't know my answer, but she knew who I needed to talk to. She knew what other records I needed to look at. That's the person you want to talk to. So talk to those town historians, particularly the small town historians. They know what's going on in the town. Frequently, they're part of the historical society. They're part of the genealogy community in that area. So there are other people to talk to as well. Whew, that's a lot. I didn't realize I had so much to say on this. So hey, Pam, it's good to see you. So yes, so these are just three of the places that I actually use and go seek out when I'm trying to find where that ancestor is buried. So, I'm going to, again, look at the death certificate if it's a time period they're using death certificates. If it's pre that, you just have to look at what you've got, what death records might be available for that location and see if they've indicated where somebody was buried. Funeral home records, we don't necessarily think to look there, but they're out there. You just have to look for them and you have to look hard for them, definitely. And then of course, reach out to the cemetery office when you think you might know something. But here's another question. When you're talking with anybody, whether you're talking to people in the funeral home community, profession, whether you're talking to the cemetery office, whether you're talking to the town historian, the library, I would encourage you to never leave those conversations, never leave those emails without asking, who else should I talk to? Who else, if you're talking to people in the funeral home, maybe you say, well, okay, so maybe they're not familiar with the family cemetery you're thinking about, but you might say, so who else should I talk to learn about old family cemeteries in this area? Okay. And they may have somebody that you can talk to. So I'm always asking, who else should I talk to, so that I can keep moving forward in my research. Pam uses funeral homes records a lot. That's great. Katie said, who do you Google Historical Society of such and such town? Absolutely. You can. I do that all the time. I'll Google Historical Society of whatever county or town. I'll Google Genealogy Society if I'm trying to find names about that kind of thing to ask. When it comes to, if I need to go through a town office or a county office, then I just go to their main page on the website and look up burials and search for burials, and it will tell you what office is in charge of that particular burial activities for the town or for that area. So, and again, that's not the first place I go, but it is definitely one I wanted to kind of put out there, because we don't necessarily think about looking there. We're definitely going to look at, and I'm going to put a link to the post that I highlighted this week. I've got like 7 places total that you can go look for that, where an ancestor was buried. But I really kind of wanted to highlight these today because these are sometimes we don't necessarily think about. We tend to overlook these 3, but certainly you've got the obituaries, you've got the funeral home cards, you've got newspapers, accountings. So there's lots of places out there that you could potentially look, but I wanted to definitely bring these 3 to your attention to maybe broaden where you're looking at. So yes, another place would be cemetery surveys that have maybe done by the WPA projects, or if it was done at the state archaeological projects, because these are surveys that have been done of like small family cemeteries. They may have just been done by volunteers. They could have been surveys that were formally done when, say, a construction was going to take place, and there was, it's old family land. There's an old cemetery on that land. They have to do a survey of that. Those can have a lot of information there as well. So that's another thing that you can look at. So Debbie says she can't find the death certificate or cemetery for your great-grandfather. He's in the New York State Death Index, but the county clerk in his town of residence has no record of him. Yeah, that is always a really kind of tough place to do it. It's possible great-grandfather, so depending on the date, he could have possibly died somewhere else. He could have possibly been in a small family cemetery that just hasn't been well documented yet. You might want to maybe look at, say, his wife or some of his children to see if you can determine where they're buried. Oh, in 1969. Debbie, that could be an interesting. This sounds terrible. This is so modern, really, for so much of what we typically work in. But I'm wondering if that's a privacy issue. I don't know if New York has any. They're pretty strict with their privacy issues, so I don't know if they would actually give that out. You would think they would, for that kind of thing. You may want to consider, and with the death certificate. Okay, so I think the reason you're having trouble finding a death certificate for January of 1969 was probably privacy. Most states will not release them that close in, would be my guess. We coming up, well, we should be 50 years plus, but they may be waiting longer. So that may be part of what's happening is the privacy laws may be getting you. In that case, maybe seek out the obituaries. Maybe if you can find out where other folks are buried, then you might be able to get a line on where his place of burial could be. So yeah, that would be my suggestion on that with this. And that does get tough. I'll definitely give you that. Those can be tough places to find. Um, yeah, you've been trying. Yeah, I'm sure you have been trying to find those things. I find it difficult when they are fairly new. You could try Find a Grave. Yes, Cece's recommending Find a Grave. I use Find a Grave. I use Billion Graves. I use cemeterycensus.com a lot. Those are probably the three big ones that I use as far as cemetery specific websites that we typically use a lot of. Cemetery Census I use a lot. It doesn't cover all states. I can't remember what they're up to now. Heavy on the southern states. It started in North Carolina, so a lot of North Carolina there, but you might find others. You'll find it around the country. It's just you need to check on them. They're constantly being updated. So Katie was saying she's got a grandfather who's supposedly buried in Seven Spring Church Cemetery in North Carolina, but Find a Grave volunteer cannot find the headstone. He died in 1945. So there's a couple. The headstone may be damaged. It may not be there. It is possible that the family didn't put a tombstone up there. Okay, and here's a really way out there thought on this, Katie. And the reason I say this is it is possible if for sometimes when you go and you're looking for your ancestor and the gravestone they're flat, so they're like flat. They're not like standing up, but they're flat on the ground. Sometimes the grass and weeds grow over them, hiding them. And that sounds really kind of like, okay, Lisa, you're just kind of out there. But this happened to me. I was so excited. I was at this little church. My great-great-grandparents were, some of the founding members of this little church, rural church in southern Surrey, North Carolina. And I got to go up there. I was thrilled to be able to go up and, do my cemetery research up there. And my great-grandparents are buried, and I knew that. And, I found my great-grandmother and her burial. And I knew they were there because family, had stood there when they passed away. And I knew my great-grandfather was there as well, but I couldn't find him. I searched that whole cemetery and I could not find my great-grandfather's grave. And so I went back to my great-grandmother's and I was like, okay, here she is. This is Stella White. I'm like, by all accounts, Papa should be right next to her, right? Spouse should be right next to her. So I kind of sidestepped a little ways and I'm like, he should be here. And I started looking at the grass and I realized the grass had literally grown over the tombstone. So I'm down there and I literally dug the grass out around the tombstone and poured a bottle of water on it so we could see it. And there it was. So he was there all along. But if you did not know that he was there, you would never know it. So that's my story about digging out the gravestone of my great-grandfather. Faye said she had something similar too. So they do get buried. So Katie, that could be an issue depending on what type of gravestone they had there. So I would definitely consider that as well. I'm trying to think of other crazy things in the cemeteries that I've found. Those are probably the biggest issues that I've had when it comes to finding. If I can't find something and I know they're there, it's been grown over, the tombstone has been damaged or just is no longer there if it was ever there. And then I'm trying to think. There was another one, again, having field stones. So there was one older cemetery I was in. It was a church cemetery. And this church, believe it or not, had a mailbox at their cemetery where they put in it. They had a notebook and they basically had everybody listed and what row they were and where they were. I mean, that's like your genealogist dream, right? But the only problem was, while we had the oral history, the ancestor was there were some others that we couldn't find. And they were right next to my great-grandmother. There were 3 field stones marking graves. And I don't know who they were. I have to assume they were family based on who else was around her, but I don't know who they were. So it's possible those are we miss on some of those older ancestors. We miss it because it's a field stone and not an actual tombstone. What information would be found on cemeterycensus.com? Very similar, actually, Katie, to what you would find at find a grave. I don't typically see as many photographs. It typically will give you information on the cemetery and give you GPS coordinates for a cemetery. And then it will basically, it's a transcription of all of the tombstones that are there. So that's what they have there with that. Those guys did a great job, have done a great job with those. So again, it's fairly limited in scope, but it is very helpful. And since you have North Carolina ancestors, Katie, I would definitely recommend that you take a look at it. And you're right, it's just cemeterycensus.com. So it also tells you who surveyed the cemetery, and so you can reach out to those people who surveyed that particular cemetery, and you can perhaps get more information from them as well. So when you do find some of these cemeteries that are surveyed or evidence online that volunteers have surveyed and put online, reach out to those people, because sometimes they have more information. Much like the gentleman who I was looking at a cemetery, and he said, yes, the ancestor's there. And we know this because of church records, but the stones are fairly damaged. So that helped me feel confident that I had found the right place. It was just the church records that were needed. So yeah, I would absolutely check that site out, Katie. It's very helpful. All right, guys. So let's see what else is happening at Are You My Cousin? Seems like it's been really busy lately around here. I'm actually really right in the middle of a lot of speaking. So yes, I do. I'm in kind of a speaking season right now. So if you guys are looking for speakers, feel free to check out my speaker page. That'll be good. Don't forget, we're going to Alaska in June of 2022. So be sure and check out the Alaskan cruise for Are You My Cousin, because you can cruise and do genealogy all at the same time. And really, what's better than doing two really cool things together at the same time? I'm thinking, I'm looking forward to it, because I keep thinking it'll be like doing genealogy research and watching the whales out the window. Maybe I'm being a little overly optimistic, but I'm like, wouldn't that be so cool to see? All right, so we've got another question here. Comment in the I just dropped the link for the Alaskan cruise there. Bivra said, your great-great-grandmother had the wrong first name on the stone. Yes, I do see that. The stone was probably bought later, and because she went by the middle name, whoever bought it put the wrong name on it. Her name was Furba or Furbia, and Francis was on the stone. Helps so much to put the puzzle together. You're bringing up a great point here. Yes, sometimes stones were not placed even within, the same generation. They could have been placed much later. So sometimes information was wrong. I've seen it where first and middle names were reversed. I've seen misspellings. I have seen maybe you only knew an ancestor by a nickname, but the real name was put on the stone. And sometimes these things were not changed because it was expensive, for one thing. And so, they may not have had the stone placed fairly soon after the death because it was expensive, and maybe the family had to save up money. So there are a lot of reasons for that to happen. And that can happen as well. So yeah, so that's a good thing. That's the kind of thing that a cemetery record or a funeral home record can help you sort out sometimes if you're having if you have a gravestone era issues. And just that brings up the fact that gravestones tend to be secondary sources and not primary sources when it comes to genealogy research, because depending on when it was placed, the memory of the person placing the information may not be as accurate as we would like sometimes. So we have to keep all of that together as well and to think about. So there you have it. Definitely hop over to the website if you want to see more places to look for, to find out where your ancestor was buried. I go into more over there in that post, and you're welcome to check that out. I'll make sure it's in the description below if you are watching this on replay at YouTube and on Facebook. And just remember, guys, no Facebook Live next week because it is the Thanksgiving holiday, so we'll take that day off. And I hope you guys enjoy your Thanksgiving holiday, and I will see you in 2 weeks then. Have a great day, guys. Bye.